Please welcome Bishop Andy Lewter to the show. Bishop Andy has 40 years serving in the ministry. His education includes Oberlin College, Harvard University, United Theological Seminary. He's pastored 3 congregations over 35 years and has worked extensively in the area of Christian education and media. How are you doing? And welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much, Sister Janine, and I'm delighted to be here and happy to have this opportunity to speak with you and your audience.
I'm glad you're here as well. So before you achieved all those things, what was your insurmountable odds? What kind of things did you face that was very, very challenging in your life?
Well, I grew up a child of the 60s. I was born in 1954, just 1 year prior to the tragic death of Emmett Till in Mississippi. And so I grew up under the shadow of the intimidation and all of the social flaws that were associated with the Emmett Till era. I actually, along with my sister, were what were called integration babies. We were the first Blacks to be allowed to go to an all-white school in a suburb community of New York City. And of course, there were seeds of doubt and assaults on my self-esteem that was planted there by those early elementary school teachers. And so if I had to identify, Sister Mitchell, an insurmountable odds, it was overcoming the disdain and the negativity that was planted in my mind by those teachers who certainly wanted to restrict and limit not only my social mobility, but my mental growth as well. It took me, I was an outstanding academic student in the earlier grades, but a particular church, school administrator placed me in a class that did not push me or help me to realize my potential. And it took some 5 years for me to get back to where I was originally scheduled to be. And so those were the insurmountable odds: self-doubt, assaults on my self-esteem, and doubts as to whether or not I was truly worthy to do those things that I knew within myself I had the potential to do.
Oh, wow. So you really have, I mean, so you overcome racial hatred, right?
Yeah, and it was systemic, Sister Mitchell. Back then, we had here on Long Island, we had what was called a tracking system. And so the students who were destined to go to college and perform extremely well scholastically and academically were placed in the A track. Those who were mediocre and average were placed in the B track. And then those who were destined for vocational skills or vocational futures were placed in the C track. Now, I had qualified for A track courses, but because my 4th grade teacher did not believe that I was equipped or qualified or should be in some of the more advanced courses, placed me in some of the mediocre and more average courses. And it wasn't until I reached the 9th grade or almost high school that I was able to climb back to those courses that actually prepared me for my future. And so it was racial disdain and systemic racism that I found myself victimized by.
Wow. Wow. So what was it that kind of got you back on track? I mean, did you meet mentors or some people to restore you from those type of emotions that you felt about yourself mentally? And
well, first and foremost, Sister Mitchell, I had some very dedicated parents who always recognized the worth, the value, and the assets that I possessed. And even though the school system sought to limit and restrict my growth, they had my best interests at heart. When I reached my sophomore year in high school, I found myself embroiled in a racial conflict in our local high school that resulted in a year-long boycott and protest movement, literally outside the doors of our local school. And so I got very little schooling, very little education that year. And as a result, I was ousted out of that school that had misaligned my academic growth and potential. And my parents had the resolution and the resolve to place me in a parochial school that tapped into what my potential was. And so that last year, my 11th year and 12th year, ended up becoming stellar years, ended up qualifying me for a collegiate career and academic growth that would not have been available if I had remained where I was. And so I first and foremost credit my parents, who saw something in me and would not give up on me. And then I credit the administrators and the faculty at the school that I relocated to really push me to my maximum and my optimal output in terms of my scholastic accomplishments.
That's amazing. And they are a blessing. Your parents were a blessing in your life. Also during our meet and greet, you mentioned that you were a single father. What
Indeed.
was that experience like for you?
Certainly.
And how did
Well,
that happen? Yeah.
I was married in the shadows of Prince Charles and Lady Diana. And so I kind of saw myself or styled myself after this royal couple that had done so very, very well in merry old England. The demise of my marriage took place in 1985. And I ended up raising a daughter and then a son as a single parent in the latter days of the 1980s and early 1990s. Now, today, that is not as featured an accomplishment as it was, say, 20, 30 years ago. The social norms of that particular day were altogether different than what they are today. Single parents, single mothers are given a great deal of latitude, a great deal of space to operate and to do what it is that they need to do to effectively raise their children. But in the 80s and 90s, I found myself in a juggling act. I was a full-time pastor. And so that was an all-encompassing task. But I had to integrate into that schedule the raising of my children. My daughter had a number of extracurricular activities that she enjoyed. My son was an athlete. And so I was constantly having to decide, do I go to a basketball game or do I go to a Bible study? Do I go to a parent-teacher conference or do I go to a football game? But I was able to find a balance between the two. And of course, I kind of revised my outlook, Sister Mitchell. I grew up at a time when the assumption was that ministry was everything. It was first, foremost, and the highest priority that one could have. I adopted a motto and a slogan that said, family is our first ministry. So when it came down to me performing a professional task as opposed to something that was fatherly or something that was parental, I always chose the more parental activity because I felt that was my first calling. And while I was very, very serious about my vocation as a minister, I would not allow it to overshadow my responsibility as a parent and a father.
Wow. Well, shout outs to all the fathers who are single and they're doing dual roles. So you had to be the mom and the father.
Sure.
And not making any excuses, but just stepping up to the plate. So I know a lot of times, men or single fathers or fathers don't really get their applause. So I applaud you for that, because I was, especially during those times, like you said, that wasn't the social norm. So I don't know how much support you had, and what kind of experiences that you faced, but I'm sure it was difficult, but you made the balance. And so amen to that.
Well, let me again give a shout out to my parents, who were very, very strategic and very involved in assisting me in raising my children. They were always there, always
Good.
Available. And so when there were times when I had to make difficult choices, I had their assistance. I had sisters who also would assist in that particular area. One of my sisters in particular was raising a family herself. Her children kind of paralleled the age of my children. And so there were always friends and cousins that my children felt comfortable being around when I was not available or could not be there for major events in their lives. And then let me also say, give a shout out to the initially the Star of Bethlehem Baptist Church in Ossining, New York, and later the Oakley Full Gospel Baptist Church in Columbus, Ohio. Those two congregations saw my situation and really were instrumental and critical in helping me to be in multiple places at the same time. And so when there were times and occasions where I really could not be at the church or a church activity, they understood that and supported me in my resolve to be a good parent. And then when there were times when I really needed to be away in another city on another speaking engagement, they would step up. If my family was not available, there were always people in the congregation and church who made themselves available to assist in that area. So, you know, the old adage that it takes a village to raise a child. I was very, very fortunate to have multiple villages assist me in the raising of my children.
I totally agree. I had a past show where we actually talked about we need the villages back. And then I remember my pastor actually talking about, you know, we need to start sitting down at the table and, you know, kind of saying what's on our hearts. And we got away from that, and, you know, everybody's at the table and they're looking at their phones and all that and stuff, but we need to bring that whole village mindset back to our families. So shout out to everyone. That's your village. That was a part of your village during that time of your life. So I know you've kind of watched social media. It's so many things going on with the church. A lot of people don't want to go to church. And this is before the pandemic. So I'm not going to just blame the pandemic, but somehow or another, the reputation of the church has not been restored. It's been looked at as we're all hypocrites. You know, no one wants to go back to the physical church because of the scandals, because of whatever excuse that they may have. How can you motivate our families to come back, or just men, women in general, coming back to the physical church and realizing that the church is a hospital. A church is supposed to be a place of healing, worshiping God, you know, and there's so many different things that, you know, the church has not been known for that are positive. And there's a lot of positive things that the church has represented. What kind of motivation could you say to people who have kind of been weary and they've been disappointed, frustrated? They don't want to go back to physical church because they think that the church doesn't have anything to offer.
Well, Sister Mitchell, let me offer a word of encouragement. And I somewhat style myself as a bit of a historian, church historian in particular. And so one of the first things that I want to say and acknowledge is that this is not the first time that the church has been in this situation. This is not the first time that the church has been challenged with weak and fragile attendance. It's not the first time that the church has been under assault and attack, either because of things that it has done itself or because of its secular surroundings and a variety of ideologies that are available in secular settings that undermine what the church has historically represented. Let me see if I can go back just a little bit. Right in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, 1517 to 1531, Sister Mitchell, the world itself went through a phase that we now historians refer to as the Age of Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. It is the rise of this technical term called epistemology, which is a teaching that says that an item is not true unless there is proof or that there is evidence that that item is true. Now, that puts a bit of a strain on the church, or it did put a bit of a strain on the church in the 16th century, because the church did not operate based upon evidence and based upon proof. It operated based upon faith. The just shall live by faith. And so when secular society began to insist that proof and evidence be produced to prove that an item was true, it placed the church at a disadvantage. We had philosophers like Rousseau and Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense here in America. There was a French ideologue by the name of Voltaire. And these individuals advanced the notion and the idea that if you could not reason through a thing, if you did not have proof, if you did not have evidence of a thing, then that thing was not true. And the harsh reality, Sister Mitchell, is that at that particular time, church attendance and church support dropped to an all-time low of 20%. Churches were empty, sanctuaries were void of people, and literally, the church nearly went out of business. And I don't say that symbolically, I'm saying that literally, physically. They literally almost went out of business. What rescued the church, and I'm trying to go somewhere with this,
Take your time.
What rescued the church, Sister Mitchell, were two great movements. One was called the First Great Awakening. It took place between 1730 and 1770. It featured the likes of several revival type preachers like George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, John and Charles Wesley. So from 1730 to 1770, there was this upsurge, this revival movement that faced down the age of reason and the age of enlightenment and literally rescued the church from going out of business and becoming extinct. Again, in 1820 to 1840, there was a second Great Awakening that featured the likes of a Charles Finney, who became the first president of my alma mater there in Ohio, Oberlin College. There was an area of upstate New York in the Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse area that was called the Burned Over District because there had been so many revival movements until that area of the country was considered scorched with spiritual fervor and spiritual fire. And so I say all of that to say that we have been here before. The church has faced these kinds of indictments, these kinds of accusations, these kinds of attacks and assaults. And I am of the opinion that just as it took the First Great Awakening, 1730 to 1770, or the Second Great Awakening, 1820 to 1840, to salvage the church 200-300 years ago, it very well may take a new spiritual movement, an upsurge, a third Great Awakening, another revival movement to do for us in our time what the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening did in the past. And one of the featured characteristics, Sister Mitchell, one of the reasons that the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening was productive and was successful and was effective was because they opted not to do things the way they had always been done. People who had immigrated here from Europe, they were accustomed to going to church and sitting in these large pews and these major sanctuaries and these edifices and these buildings that were majestic and Gothic. But the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening took the church out of indoors, outdoor revival meetings. The cement and brick layered churches were replaced with tents and outdoor meetings that would last days on end. I am convinced that just what the age of enlightenment was a response to the Industrial Revolution that took place in the 16th and the 17th century. Well, we have an informational revolution, and the age of information has done to the church today what the industrial age did to the church of yesteryear. And just as the church had to resort to what was then considered extreme measures in order to survive and attract the attention of the general public, we may have to come out of our sanctuaries. We may have to resort to online platforms. We may have to entertain virtual space and virtual activity so that we can do for our generation and in this time frame what our ancestors, what our great-grandparents were forced to do in the 17th and the 18th century. There very well may need to be a repeat of that in the 21st century. And while we may not construct tents in an open field and have an open air revival. We may have to operate in cyberspace. We may have to tackle the virtual reality in which we live. We may have to develop a digital identity so that we can be as effective in this day as the Jonathan Edwards, the George Whitfields, the Wesley brothers, and the Charles Finneys were in yesteryear.
Wow. So we need a revival, but it may have to be virtual sometimes, or we have to not just limit God in how we're going to have a revival.
And I don't know what the final outcome will be, but I do know this, Sister Mitchell. You can't expect to get any different results if you continue to do the same thing. So whatever it is that we do, it's gonna have to be something different than what we've done in the past, because what we have learned is that whatever we've done in the past no longer works.
It's no longer working. So we have to evolve as everything else is evolving, but still pretty much keeping the core of the church that represented healing, deliverance, but we have to do it on a different type of platform. And we may have to use some of our resources, and that would be through virtual way. Okay.
Indeed.
Yeah, I agree. So speaking of virtual, so you believe that you can still get, even though you're not in a physical church, you can still get the power, or the power of God still can resonate as you're watching from home. You believe that?
Well, I do, with a certain amount of restraint and a certain amount of reality, Sister Mitchell. I would not be so naive as to think that what I make available on a computer screen or a television screen is an apt substitute or replacement for an in-person worship experience. Now, what I do think that both of the experiences have in common is the availability of the word. Whether I'm in person or I'm online, I am able to deliver the word. What I can't deliver is the experience and the spiritual covering that goes along with an in-person experience. And I, like so many others, I am wrestling with how to compensate for that deficit on the back end. So I can still quote John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. So what is critical and crucial is the delivery of the word. I certainly can do that whether I am in person or I am online. But there is a certain feeling, there's a certain experience that accompanies being in person, being in fellowship, being in close proximity with people of like mind and like spirit, that can't be replaced online. The other item that I think we have to be careful of is that online invites us to become, watch this, it invites us to become observers rather than participants. When you are in church, you're clapping your hands, you're patting your feet, you're part of a communal experience. When you're online, you're watching what other people are doing. So the challenge that I think that we're faced with is, how do we make the online experience an interactive experience? Not one that people simply observe and watch from afar, but something that they are invited to participate in. In 1898, my mother's father, my maternal grandfather, Bishop William Edward Fuller Sr., started the Fire Baptized Holiness Church of God of the Americas. And I want to give a shout out to Bishop Rogers, Bishop Davis, and Bishop Frazier, who are the current bishops of the Fire Baptized Church. And I want to commend them because they, in my estimation, Sister Mitchell, have done the best job of taking an online experience and embedding in that experience a sense of community and a sense of fellowship. So when you go to one of their services, you're invited to clap your hands, you're invited to say something online, you're invited to do something to let those who are sponsoring the online experience, number one, know that you're there, but number two, know that you are participating in the overall experience. It's not enough for us simply to produce a production that people are entertained by. We need an experience that people can interact with.
Interact, that's key. So then that means that what we should also be thinking, those who are watching, they're online virtually, is that they have to kind of bring up their level of their relationship with the Lord, like on their own. Like they got to still be having an appetite for the things of God, but also participating, not just like you said, just being a spectator. So there are some things that you have to do on your own time. So by the time you get online, you know, your mindset is like, I'm participating, I'm interacting, but it's not just entertainment. It's not entertainment. It's like you have to do something on your own to get what you need as well, you know, from the men and women of God that are teaching or are preaching.
Yeah, I'm convinced that it takes attitude. And just as you got up, you got dressed, and you started to have church before you went to church, you know, maybe that was humming a song, maybe that was reflecting on the week and what the Lord had brought you through. Maybe that was rehearsing a testimony that you had planned to give in church. Very few people waited until they got to church in order to have church. And I think what's missing in our digital online experience is that we're waiting for the screen to do everything for us. But we're going to have to duplicate some of our behavior of the past, whereby before I turn on the computer, before I turn on the screen, before I turn on the microphone, there are some acts of preparation that I'm going to need to do that. So by the time I find myself in worship, I'm already there. I'm not leaning and depending upon the digital device to get me in the mood to worship. You know, our parents and our grandparents used to say, Sister Mitchell, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on Jesus. Yes. And the whole idea there was that by the time I got to church, my mind has already been planted, and I refuse to let anything distract or take my attention away from my focus and my concentration on worship. Now, therein lies the problem, Sister Mitchell, because the truth of the matter is, I am online right now. If I were to put my still picture up instead of my active camera, I could go to my notebook, I can go to my telephone, I could text, I could juggle, I could multitask, and I could allow other things to impede, interrupt, and distract me from my focus upon worship. Somehow we're going to have to overcome the limited attention span that people have online and help them to focus on the moments of worship that they have available to them.
Yes, I agree. So what do you believe that the pandemic has taught the believers as we went through tragedy, losses of lives, job loss? We're just like in a state of oppression. We're coming out of it, but what has it taught the believers?
I would hope, Sister Mitchell, that the experience of the pandemic has reinforced in people's mind their dependence upon God. Who would have thought that we would have lost hundreds of thousands of people in the course of 6 months, in the course of 12 months? And if anything, this pandemic has taught us just how fragile life is. So many people who were here last year, this time, 2 years ago, this time, they are not here now. And so you can't take life for granted. You just can't assume that you're going to be here 5 years from now. You can't assume that you're going to be here 10 years from now. That means that we have to do all that we can while we can, when we can. And we have to make the most, get this, beloved, we have to make the most out of every moment, because longevity is not promised to us. And you don't want to look back and say, I wish I had done this, I could have done that, I would have done that. No, I think it makes time more precious, and it causes us, it even forces us to appreciate time and to place a greater premium upon time, so that we understand that whatever it is that I have to do. I need to go ahead and do that now because tomorrow is not promised to me.
I totally agree. So we discussed that you were considering or you're going to retire.
Going, I'm sorry, going where?
That you're going to retire? Yes.
Yes.
Am I allowed to give this information out?
Sure. Oh, yes, by all means.
So you're going to retire, and I got a chance to see one of your sermons, and the way you're on fire, I don't see how you're ready to retire, but I imagine you're going to redirect that energy into something else. So what can we expect from Bishop Andy going forward in the future? What can we expect from you when you retire?
Okay, well, I started preaching in 1973. And so I have been doing this nearly 50 years. I've pastored 4 congregations. I started in a congregation in upstate New York, Westchester County, a town called Ossining, New York, Star Bethlehem Baptist Church in Ossining, New York. I remained there 7 years. I spent the next 20 years in Columbus, Ohio, at the Oakley Baptist Church on Columbus's west side. And then from there, I returned home to a terminally ill mother to help take care of her, along with my father. My father had been pastoring his congregation for over 40 years.
Wow.
He at that time wanted to retire so that he could spend the waning moments of my mother's life with her. And so I took over his congregation. I've been here now in New York 20 years. So 2027 is 47 years of pastoring with another 3 to 4 years of preaching as an evangelist prior to becoming a pastor. So I've been doing this just under 50 years. And so the day-to-day ordeal of pastoring, I feel that I've done all that I can in that regard. What I will not cease doing is proclaiming the word. And I may not have the same regularity. I may not have the same appointments that I've had in the past, but as occasion comes and arises, I certainly intend to deploy that fire that you talked about in a variety of pulpits that invite me to come and to do so. I mentioned to you before that I'm very passionate about history, and so I want to do some writing. I've done some writing in the past. I want to do some teaching, and I feel that the online platforms like Teachable and LearnWorld and Podia all represent opportunities to reach people with some giftings that I have that perhaps I could not effectively exercise when I was in the pulpit ministry. And so I don't intend to slow down, because I've seen people who have retired and attempt to stop doing everything that they were doing become a prelude to their own demise. And so I want to stay active. I want to stay involved. I want to stay around young people. That's why our collaboration and meeting you through Daily Gospel Network was so exciting to me, because as long as I'm making contact with people who are doing, I am certainly ready to pass the baton off to the next generation, but I do want to stay on the sidelines, coach from the sidelines, and be a fan and be a cheerleader from where I am.
That's awesome. Great. I'm so glad that I know you're going to still keep going. I know that for sure. So are your webinars, you're currently doing a webinar now, and is it open to the public, or how is that? Are you picking students, or how is that going?
Sure.
Webinar.
Yeah, I have a couple of different platforms. My major teaching platform, Sister Mitchell, is S as in Sam, T as in Tom, C as in cat, U as in under, STCU Teachable, TEACHABLE, teachable.com. I have been able to assemble over 60 online courses. They're primarily religious and theological, because that's who I am and that's what I am. Many of them are historical. I take a good, long, in-depth look at the history of the church. I have a course entitled the history of the church, the first 500 years, the second 500 years, the third 500 years, and then the last 500 years. And so my major offerings are at stcu.teachable.com. I also have material that's available on my church's website, which is hollywoodfullgospel.com. And then I have a second website for the second congregation that I have in New York City, and that's queensministryonline.com. And you can go to any of those places and get material that I have available. One of the things, Sister Mitchell, that I'm extraordinarily excited about, I recently launched 2 weekly podcasts. One is Living Your Best Life, and that's a self-help, self-improvement weekly episode that I do to help people optimize who and what they are. And then my second podcast is entitled This Week in Church History, where I take some episode, some chapter of history in the 2,000 plus year history of the Christian church. I celebrate that, I highlight that, I teach that in about a 5 to 6 minute segment and make that available to those who have an interest in that.
Well, I thank you, Bishop Andy, for coming in and giving us all your wisdom and all your pearls. So I look forward to you being, collaborating with you in September. We're going to do a webinar together. And you're always welcome to come back to the show. Please, you're on Daily Gospel Network. Do you want to tell the name of your program?
Sure. Yeah, I'm on Daily Gospel Network every week on Sunday morning from 5:30 a.m. to 6 a.m., 5:30 a.m. to 6 a.m. Brother Sanders has kindly